as you know, Garry has been signed to fight MVP. Now, it took a British man to literally stand up and take a fight against an Irishman, right? Now, what's strange about this is the original matchup that was supposed to be made was against Colby Covington. And by the way, I'm kind of glad that there's a story that we can make out of this. Because I gotta tell you, one of the main reasons why I've always wanted to do MMA content, not just the fact that I've been doing mixed martial arts for a certain number of years on top of the single compository sports that are involved with winning a bronze medal and 10 years old in Taekwondo, on top of winning amateur kickboxing titles out here in California. And then on top of that, training with some of the best fighters in the world, some people that you may have seen on the UFC and some of the biggest platforms in the world of professional fighting. But nonetheless, it's a sport that not only am I passionate about in terms of breaking down the kicks and the punches, but also the storylines that are involved in it, which sort of touches the apparatus of culture, and not only that, sports management, but not only that, also geopolitics. Now, speaking of which, obviously, Colby Covington is a big part of this particular story. Why? For one, you obviously know that he built his whole entire gimmick into being this unreasonable Trump supporter. In other words, playing the bad guy to the role of its greatest potential to captivate heat, as they say in the professional wrestling world. Well, the problem now is that Colby Covington can't show a realism about himself. And what do I mean by that? Let's be honest about this. He's scared to fight Garry. He may call him a cuck, he may call him a BICTH and things of that nature. But the reality is, if you break down the reality of combat sports to its greatest core, bravado doesn't matter. In other words, you can be the loudest guy in the room. You can even be the scariest gangster in the room, the guy who has all the bodies in his freaking record and all that. But when it comes to unarmed, skill for skill, combat sports fighting, you cannot lie in there. And most times, you know who you are, you know who your opponent is, and you know the limits of your capabilities in the comparison to your opponent. In this case, let's be honest, with the high level that Colby Covington is at, he understands fighting more than likely the majority of the people around the world do. I would say about 99% of the world, he understands fighting because he's done something most of you really will never experience a day in your life, which is what? Not only win an interim title, but even fight for the absolute undisputed title of it all, in which he lost. So which means he understands his limits to his detrimental flaws and his greatest weaknesses. He understands this, which means he also understands the greatest strength of Garry. Now, what's the cultural significance about this, right? Obviously, I gotta be honest with you, Colby Covington strikes me as somebody as what you would consider a MAGA tough guy, machismo type of dude, right? In other words, let's be honest, he is a high-level fighter, right? But obviously, even if you're a high-level fighter, there are people that have your number. So there are certain guys that you're going to say no to in terms of the limits that you understand. But guess what? This relates to, for example, this little traffic incident that I got going on, right? Nothing that is incriminating or anything like that, but let me just say just anecdotal experiences that are unrecorded to that degree. A lot of these guys that have all these weird road rages, I gotta be honest with you, the majority of them that I've run across that are like that are usually these MAGA bro dudes. And again, it's nothing against Trump or 45 or anything like that. In fact, there's a lot of aspects of his political beliefs that I can get behind, and then there's other things that I'd rather not talk about, in which that I may cold-heartedly disagree with him on. A whole lot of topics, but nonetheless, it's not against him or his political beliefs, but rather this small division of people within his supporting group that, let's just be honest, are a lot of bark but no spark. Okay? One example, this one guy, I'm going to be honest with you, the way that I drive on the road, it's, I'd rather not say, but let me just say this. If I want to get to one point A to the other, there's not going to be any infractions that I'm going to be opposed to in order for me to get to the objective that I'm getting at. So in other words, there's going to be a lot of people that are going to be angry and upset at what I do on the road. So here's one story and one example. There's one guy I cut off in the middle of the road, and then he sees me at a stop sign, and he acts like it's the biggest personal thing against him. And how do I know, without generalizing, that he was a MAGA bro dude? Well, obviously you could tell by the stickers on their car and some indications like that that I'd rather not mention, just to not incriminate anybody to the story, because I just don't do that. But nonetheless, I looked at him and I said, bro, you want to get out and run the fade out here? I'm like, let's go. And then I realized that he was just doing nothing but calling himself bluff. You see, I'm going to be honest with you. There's a lot of people out there that are absolute Boy Scouts, right? And again, this is the beauty of this particular content, is being able to transition the mixed martial arts talk to real life scenarios. There's a lot of guys out there that are Karens, that are Kevins, that, let's say, are, how do I say this? People that will tattle, okay, for lack of a better term. And when you're dealing with people like that, they really rely upon the law to save them in any kind of degree. I'm going to be honest with you, I don't have a problem with cops. In fact, there's a lot of police that I've trained with over the years in mixed martial arts gyms and boxing gyms and all various forms of martial arts for these guys, in order to get better at their self-defense tactics in which that they need to survive out there in the cold streets, right? So, in other words, I don't have a problem with them. But at the same time, I got to be honest with you. They're not the type of people that I would call to solve my problems, if you understand my drift, right? And that's just the God-honest truth about it. However, there are people that rely on them so much that when they get into any infraction in the streets or in any type of public place, guess what happens? They rely upon them heavily, to the point where they will call upon them, tattle on someone with literally no evidence. And again, Colby Covington is literally that same guy, not just in his persona that he tries to promote in his fights, but also really in his real life. Because let's be honest, this is the way that he is. There's a track record of him doing this to Fabricio Verdum. I urge you to look that up. He's done this to Jorge Masvidal. Obviously, you've seen what happened with their off-the-cage extracurricular activities that they had going on in Miami. You know about that. That's all documented. And then on top of that, if you were to do it to him again in a public setting, rest assured that he'll call anybody, the LAPD, the NYPD, the Sydney PD, anybody that is PD, in order for him to escape the DP. And for those that know exactly what I'm talking about. Nonetheless, that's the kind of person that you're dealing with Colby Covington. He knows his limits. Just like this dude in the road rage. He knew exactly where his limits were. He knew that, not knowing that I've trained with some of the best fighters in the world, that I would literally get out of the car and do whatever I wanted with him, to my own reservation of whether I want to inflict more pain or damage on him or not. The reality is that he didn't want to do it for whatever reason. He didn't know me. He didn't know me from a can of paint. Let's just be honest about it. But he wasn't what he was really portraying himself to be. This machismo tough guy that, quite frankly, had no business being in there with me in any kind of fade whatsoever. And that's not being cocky or arrogant or anything. That's just being really honest. So going back to Colby Covington, he knows his limits against Garry, and this is why he doesn't want to do it. He can call him all the names in the world. He can call him a liberal this, cuck boy that, or whatever phrase he wants to get at him, or any low-hanging fruit that he can find to hammer at Garry. By the end of the day, when it comes to face-to-face combat, whether it's sanctioned fights, non-sanctioned fights, street fights, or fades. There are just guys out there that are not really about it. And then there are guys that understand their limits, and that's the most that they will go. And I think this is where Colby Covington is, because let's be honest, let's not take away anything from him. He's a very tough guy. But guess what? Let's talk kicks and punches. Suppose he was to go shoot in on Ian Garry. What would have happened? Ian Garry would have stuffed those takedowns, fight at range to which where Ian Garry is at most comfortable, and literally pick him apart with jabs, front kicks, and even calf kicks in between, along with body kicks that would eventually put Colby Covington away. And by the way, that is my official prediction if that fight ever happens, or if Colby Covington grows a pair to actually answer the call on that. But again, Colby Covington is entitled to do what he wants to do. He's a legend. But rest assured, understand there are guys out here that duck fights because they know that it's bad for their health. And quite frankly, can you blame them? No. But we're not here to talk about what is good or what is right or what is the ethical thing to do. What we are talking about is, what would you do? Just like that dude that wanted to get out of his car in the middle of traffic and run a fade with me, what would he do? Absolutely nothing. Because they're not prepared for this. So imagine that. If Colby Covington, one of the toughest guys in the world, ain't even prepared for that, what makes you think you guys out there that are untrained, that see red and all of a sudden think that you can handle yourself, what do you think would happen to you if you ran across somebody that knew what they were doing in the streets? I'm talking about an unarmed fight, because obviously there's enough gun and crime, knife violence to go around to put in those statistics, but I'm talking about mutual unarmed combat. Most of you, true to God honesty, would say no. And guess what? Colby Covington is doing this at the highest level. He's saying no because even with all the jokes and all the pun that he throws at Ian Garry, he knows that he ain't trying to run that fade, homie. Because guess what? Here's something you need to understand from the humanistic side of MMA. There are some guys that are just always going to have your number because stylistically certain fights style well with other fights in order for them to look brutal as the way that they would. In this case, what I mentioned to you, the range of Ian Garry, the jabs, the punches, also the elbows that he may throw at Ian Garry if he was at Colby Covington if he was to come close range. Not to mention the knee shots that he would throw in defense of Colby Covington shooting in for a single leg, which, by the way, would be very detrimental to his head if he was to get placed with a knee at the right place at the right time in the event that he shoots in. Very bad matchup for him. But he knows this from the humanistic side. So what does he have to do? He has to go and devalue Ian Garry. Say that he's not really that good. He's not really that known. He's not a big money marquee matchup. When in reality, when Ian Garry had that fiasco going on with his fiance and all the weird books that she was writing and things of that nature, guess what? It made him even more popular, not in the positive sense, but in the sense where he garnered attention for people to pay attention to his fights. And you're telling me that that's not a guy that can make money with you? But guess what? In comes MVP. He steps in, and I'm going to tell you how this matchup is going to go. I got to be honest with you, this is actually one of the times where MVP, Michael Venom Page, has to actually use his grappling skills. Why? It's not so much that Ian Garry is a superior striker, it's more of the disciplined striker versus the unorthodox striker in Michael Venom Page. Now, what are some examples in boxing that I can relate to in this MMA match that I could draw from to give you a certain example? How about Barrera versus Prince Nassim? When you saw that fight, you saw a very elusive, very footwork heavy Prince Nassim against a very disciplined striker in Barrera. Who won in the end of that? You want to know who? Prince Nassim lost to a guy that was more disciplined in his strikes. In other words, the unorthodox way of fighting is very useful. However, it can be very detrimental in terms of mistakes. Whereas you look at somebody like Ian Garry or Barrera, they didn't waste any energy. Unless, of course, Barrera was in close range hitting you with body shots fighting you Mexican style close range with those power shots from that particular distance, close distance. Whereas with Prince Nassim had this unpredictable way of fighting where he himself didn't even know what he was going to do. And in the process, that could also just lend to not knowing what to do when you get hit with a certain shot, a much more disciplined shot, which is why Ian Garry is a much more dangerous striker in this particular matchup, even though Michael Venom Page seems to be more of the electrifying striker. So the reality of this is that, unfortunately, even though I like Michael Venom Page, Ian Garry is a bad matchup for Michael Venom Page, and Ian Garry is a bad matchup also for Colby Covington, and that is the reason why he's ducking this fade. So don't forget to not duck the fade in liking and subscribing, and I'll see you guys on the next one, inshallah.